Welcome everybody to tonight's Build the Era event with Emily Voorde. She is our guest, and we are going to be talking about the issue around disability and accessibility and how accessibility in transportation is so important. Many of you know Emily because she was a very visible member of Team Pete, and we're going to get into her introduction in just a moment. If you are new to Build the Era is committed to making the Department of Transportation's role in American movement understood by citizens and activating them to engage for smart and equitable investments by the Department of Transportation and for better multimodal planning in their communities. And so we'd like to thank you for being here to help us contribute to the attainment of our mission, our vision, and living our values. Some news from Build the Era: we are completing our second annual report. It will be published in the next couple weeks. So please, if you are on our mailing list, you will see that. If you are not on our mailing list, make sure that you go to buildtheera.com and sign up and be part of our mailing list. I also would like to note that last month we had our launch for Rhonda Loves Roundabouts, and the book is now in its second printing. And so we will have more updates on how you can get your copy of Rhonda Loves Roundabouts at the end of tonight's program. So tonight's event, Build the Era is honored to have Emily Voorde join us in a conversation focused on accessibility as we mark July being Disability Pride Month. Emily recently served as an associate director in the White House Office of Public Engagement as the Biden-Harris administration's liaison to disabled Americans and K-12 educators. A South Bend native, which is where she is at right now, she also served as Chasten Buttigieg's body woman during the Pete Buttigieg 2020 presidential campaign. Her focus and her passion are centered on justice for individuals with disabilities and equitable access to education. Her conversation tonight with Build the Era will include how we can advocate for more access in all modes of transit and transportation, both public and private, and ways to be an ally to the disabled community. She will also share her personal experiences as a wheelchair user navigating transportation. Accessibility is also one of Build the Era's rules of the road for public safety. And we're grateful to have Emily helping us truly understand its importance in transport and for everybody. So thank you very much, Emily. Emily is currently serving as an associate director with Newco Strategies, which is a full-service strategic consulting firm that helps progressive campaigns, organizations, and companies achieve their goals. She has received I always like, because I am a higher education nerd, I like to make sure we highlight where our guests received their education. So she has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Notre Dame, a Master's of Education from the University of Notre Dame, and a Master's of Public Policy and Education from Vanderbilt University. And so she currently serves as a presidentially appointed board member on the National Council on Disability and as communication directors for Notre Dame's Young Alumni Board, a big lift and a lot of work because our volunteers on our alumni boards never received the amount of help that they need. So thank you for being here, Emily. That was a big introduction for a big, hugely important person. So thank you.
Oh my gosh. I don't know about that, but no, thank you. That was a very kind introduction. I am so glad to be with you all today. I see a lot of familiar names and faces and some new. So it's good. It feels a little bit like a reunion. So great to be here.
That's great. And I thank you for that. Every time we have a Build the Era event, it is sort of a Team Pete reunion. So thank you so much. I want to start with one question before we get into some of the transit questions. Some people, especially those who may be seeing this on video. Like, people from Team Pete know what a body woman is, but a lot of other people don't. Tell us what a body woman is.
That is a great question. So, as Laura mentioned, I served as Chasten Buttigieg's body woman on the 2020 presidential campaign trail. A body woman is essentially the person that is traveling with the candidate, or in this case, the candidate's spouse, to make sure that they eat, sleep, breathe, and show up to the right place on the right time and know who's going to be in the room. So keeping Chasten on schedule, but making sure he's supported as a human being as well. You get thrown into the campaign trail. You're on, sometimes upwards of 4 or 5 flights a day with connections in and out of South Bend. And you need to make sure, right, that this person who is advocating on behalf of their husband, showing the world what it can mean to, create build an administration that is inclusive and that, models belonging. They need to be fed and, energized and fueled too. So, jokes aside, it really is making sure, Chasten knows where his next meal is going to come from, that his water bottle's filled, that he knows what room he's going into next. So it was an immense privilege, not only because I, respect Chasten immensely professionally, but also because he is a great friend, a great mentor. So we were able to get a lot of work done. It was serious business, but also have fun along the way. And as a person with a disability, a very visible disability, for those of you that can't see, I'm a wheelchair user. I always remember to name that because it didn't occur to me until we were a good bit into this like very virtual posture during the pandemic, that people might not always be able to see that. And so they hear me talking about disability or about access, and they, have no context for the fact that I'm a chair user. But I'm a wheelchair user, and, very quickly having people both on the campaign trail or in the political space writ large reach out and say, you are one of the first. Their, visible disability is often not represented in politics. And so by no means was that the reason I was doing it. In fact, being one of the first, there's a lot of responsibility in that, and that sometimes made me uncomfortable. But what an immense responsibility, opportunity to be able to, pave that trail, and to meet people on the literal campaign trail that would say, how important it was to see themselves or somebody that they loved represented in this role. So, so grateful to have had the chance, and, who better to have done it alongside than my mayor, who ran for president, and his husband. So a really incredible opportunity that, in many ways changed my life. In one of those ways, brought so many of us here together today. So that's a little bit about it.
And someday you will write a memoir about it, I'm sure. And I also am sure there's
maybe, I don't know.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I don't know. You're not the first person to say that. It's funny, it's, we'll see. I think I've decided I've got to collect my own thoughts first in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
The campaign ended, and then we ostensibly a week later, the pandemic kind of quote unquote started. And still to this day, I feel like there are a lot of things about the past 4 years that I'm still processing, that I'm still making sense of. I know I'm not alone in that by any means, but maybe one day, we'll see.
Well, when you do, you'll have people here who will read it. And I'm sure there's some people here who are like, so you're the one who made sure that, Chasten ate his Cliff Bars and his damn nuts, which everybody
not his Cliff Bars. That's the sticking point, But yes, made sure that he had what he needed to get through the day, hopefully without being too frustrated by the airport selection. So
yes. And so
lots of trail mix in airport bottles of water.
Okay, so here we go. And we're going to talk about airlines. We're going to talk about planes, trains, automobiles, and the whole nine of it. Okay. And, we would like to start in terms of this because you do have a passion for and a lifelong focus on advocacy. But you don't just become an advocate. You actually have to kind of find your way into this. So talk to us about what's your lived experience and how did that lived experience kind of move you into this disability advocacy framework?
Yeah, really great question. And I was just talking to a young disabled person today, a college student who reached out, which I'm always happy to do, just kind of chat about my experiences and how, if any way, I might be able to help them. And they asked me that exact same question. They were like, how did you become an advocate? How do I become an advocate? You're right, right? Like trying to see themselves in my experience and in my journey. And to be honest, there's no one moment. I was born with my disability. So I have osteogenesis imperfecta, which is a condition that causes my bones to break relatively easily. Broken less so as I've gotten older, but still have the occasional injury and still day to day use a wheelchair. And so I grew up with a very strong sense of, my body, my personal identity, my self-advocacy. My mom, Kathy, is actually on the phone. She was a big part of that. As was my dad, my sister, my family and friends, just surrounded, from a very early age with a strong sense of myself and my body and how I was moving around this world and, when I needed to speak up, when, spaces weren't created for me. But I would say it really wasn't until, college, my early 20s, that I really saw myself as being part of a larger, kind of capital D disabled community. There weren't, when I thought about disability growing up, I thought about people that looked like me, who used wheelchairs, coming from a small Midwest town, there weren't many people that looked like me. And I found role models and mentors and support in other people, and certainly other people with disabilities of one sort or another, but I didn't necessarily connect those dots. And it wasn't until going to college, leaving, I was a classroom teacher in coastal Mississippi for a few years after college. It wasn't until leaving that it was like, oh, I'm part of something bigger, not only this larger community of people with my diagnosis, but this larger community of wheelchair users and this larger community of people with disabilities. We're 1 in 4, 1 in 5. You see different statistics thrown around depending on how numbers are counted, but 1 in 5 will say individuals, Americans, have a disability, whether that be a neurodivergent physical disability, an invisible illness, a chronic condition, a learning disability, a mental health diagnosis. That's not even exhaustive, but this larger community of people with disabilities. And so to get around to answering your question, how did I become an advocate? I think it just happened slowly over time. And I'm so, so grateful for that, for the resilience I was able to build. And I'll be the first to say that there's great privilege in that, to have come from a community, from a family that was so supportive, made sure that I had the care and the resources I needed. But then being able to turn that outward and start speaking up for others and start speaking up more largely when spaces weren't built for me. And so I am a firm believer in kind of what I'll leave, and you can, we'll move into to follow-ups from there, is I'm a firm believer that you do not need to be in what I call a disability specific or a disability focused space to be an advocate. So this young woman today was saying, what kind of job do I need to get with this disabled association, or what kind of job do I need to get in the office of disability employment policy, or what job title do I need? And while those roles are so incredibly important, any room in which we enter, by the very nature of, the lived experience that we bring, we are going to be advocates for ourselves and for our community. So it's some days that can feel overwhelming, right? But it's an immense responsibility, but and there's frustration and there's fatigue, but really, reminding myself that there's no switch that is flipped. I'm, helping to advocate for myself and my community everywhere that I go.
And I think one of the things you brought up that I want to echo is that as an advocate, a lot of times we have to think about it's not even just the jobs we're in. It's also if we're going into the supermarket. Like I live in a place where the supermarket that is literally across the street from mine, you have to take an escalator up or an elevator up. And when you can't get into the elevator, because if you're a wheelchair user, an escalator is not an option.
Right.
And so when there is an issue or you see, I'm gonna sound like the advanced age that I am, kids with horseplay in the elevator, causing issues and that sort of thing, is that idea of when do you actually speak up to say what do you do and who do you talk to, is that our role as advocates can be in the workplace, can be at the supermarket, can be while we're flying on a plane. And so we need to be more aware of that. And that's part of the reason why these conversations are so important, is that oftentimes we live in our box and we don't realize that our box is how we've created our box. And we may not be looking at how our box is impacting someone else's life. One of the things that I think is important for people to know is that when there is a setback or a challenge in advocates' lives, it's really important to surround yourself with people who are your cheerleaders. And you talked about your parents, and then you were in a space where I'm sure at the university that there was good accessibility assistance there. I'm curious about, you talked about going and teaching and being in a classroom where it's very possible that the school never had a wheelchair user teaching. How did that kind of open your eyes to how to advocate, or who in the space is going to be on Team Emily in terms of helping you to be successful in the classroom?
Oh, that's a really great question. So you are correct. It was a small school that I was teaching in. To my knowledge, they had never had a teacher with a disability in the school. I am pretty confident in saying that they had never had a student using a wheelchair in the school. And I wouldn't, don't quote me on that, but all to say, I said earlier, I was one of the only people in my town in South Bend that I knew that was a wheelchair user. In this community that I was in coastal Mississippi, I did not know a single other person who used a chair in the school or otherwise. And I was really, I think going into the situation, I'll admit that I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder. And I think that was born of, vulnerability fatigue. That was born of the internalized ableism maybe that I had about myself and my own ability, but also just anticipating, the pushback that I would get from parents or teachers or other students. Or parents or teachers or my students. And I am really grateful to say it was a phenomenal experience. I can remember the very first day of school, the night before we had kind of a meet the teacher event with the parents of my students. And my principal had approached me in advance, Miss B, a wonderful, wonderful woman, who I felt confident in and supported by from the start. And she had said, I think it'd be helpful if we have this, meet the teacher night. And she left it to me, as was appropriate, to either address my disability or not. They had these events regularly. And it was like, I leave it to you whether you want to name the elephant in the room or not. And there's no right or wrong answer to that. I think that is very personal, and everybody in that situation needs to determine that for themselves. I took the approach of not naming it. It's not going to be an issue. Take me as I am. I'm here to show you my competency. I'm here to talk about how I'm going to support your student. I'm here to talk about the curriculum and whether your kid has a peanut allergy, and there was beauty in that. I got no questions about my capacity, my ability from parents. And the really beautiful part was the students in the room that had come with their parents for this Meet the Teacher night, they were the best models of that, right? They didn't care about the chair. They wanted to know, what my favorite color was and what kind of food I ate in Indiana, and like how many miles or how many hours it took to drive from Indiana to Mississippi. And in moments, later down the road in the classroom, when they would have questions, it was organic, it was genuine. They didn't come in with these preconceived notions or this like societal ableism that had already poisoned them. They, they might interrupt a reading circle and say like, Miss Voorde, how do you get into your bed at night to sleep? And then we'd have a quick conversation because this was a safe space and we had talked about, boundaries, and I, give an answer or say, maybe this isn't the time. And then that was that. They wouldn't have any follow-up. They wouldn't challenge me on that. They wouldn't, maybe they'd ask another follow-up question, but it was never like, we don't think that's true. Nor did they try to celebrate me in a way or, say that I was an inspiration or say that I was doing this just because I was out there living my life. So that was a long roundabout way of saying, I felt very supported early on by just coming as myself, chair and all, disability and all, being vocal about the needs that I did have. And I was met immediately by just such grace from this community who, welcomed me with open arms. And I miss that a lot about the classroom. I miss, young people are sponges and they, wanted to be helpful and they wanted to learn, but they also saw me they saw me as a person with a disability that was their teacher and that was this robust, wholesome person. So anyways, it was really, really a moment in time in my life that I cherished because it was new. There were so many parts of it that were unknown. I was going through a lot of anxiety and kind of exploring some new facets of my mental health. But all along there was this community that was there to welcome me and accept me.
And this was an important part of your life in terms of your own progress and your own tradition. Absolutely. And all of that, because you're growing out of the education space of your own education, your own formal education, let's just say that. We're being educated every day. But you are going into a space where now you're the educator. And it's an important thing to acknowledge. And I think that one of the things that you were just talking about is how the students, the children, responded to you and asked questions, and how important that unfiltered observation that they had versus what happens to us as we get older. And whether it be, oh, but that's not how you say it, you shouldn't ask it that way. Or it's this kind of baked in ableism that happens over time. And I think that moves us to our next part of this conversation, which is that idea of advancements and setbacks as far as it comes to transportation. And so, you didn't just, you may have been born at night, but you weren't born last night, Emily. And so you've been around a bit of time and you've seen some changes in your life. And I think that, when you look at transportation and the aspects of transportation that you utilize, you talked about flying so much on the campaign trail. And I know that you still fly. Let's start with airlines, what you've seen over your time. And I know that there's some advancements that have just been announced by some of these airlines. What are some of the things, because we've had this conversation with other folks that have come to our events, and we hear time and time again how many wheelchairs are either lost, destroyed, damaged by the airlines. I know you've experienced this yourself. Talk to us about not just the destruction, but the verbal service and what the airlines have done right and done wrong as far as you as a wheelchair user and your perspective.
Yeah, great question. And I'm actually navigating this now in kind of an ongoing back and forth with the airlines and with my medical equipment provider. So it's fresh. Back in February, I was flying for a trip for work and got off the plane, thankfully, in South Bend. It was the last leg of the trip, and my chair was not safe to use. It was inoperable. The entire axle of the frame had been bent such that the wheel would not spin and wouldn't have been able to use it, let alone, use it on my own. And so I know I've spoken about this a lot, and so I'll keep the details brief, but in that moment, you are rendered completely not independent. Your independence is stripped away from you. And you've heard analogies drawn. I've used analogies that, it's the equivalent of, having your legs broken on a flight. That is an accurate analogy. But it's like having your leg broken on a flight and then having people not know what to do. And dare I say, like, not even really care. That's might be harsh, but there's a very little urgency around the loss, this violation of your dignity. So tactically, I'm in this aisle chair, which is essentially just a very narrow chair on wheels that somebody uses to, assist me on and off the airplane. We get to the jet bridge, my chair is damaged. That aisle chair, I can't, move independently. I transfer over to just kind of a standard, airport or hospital wheelchair that, all of us have seen, which is like a step in the right direction, but it's way too big for me. I still can't operate it on my own. So again, still dependent upon somebody else to assist me. And again, it's a really tragic scenario because the people at the South Bend airport, they're so kind, right? This is like and South Bend is like a lot of regional airports, the same guy that's getting the, help at the gate agent is also the one that's taking me to the counter to help fill out the paperwork. It's a small.
He works at the coffee shop too. Yeah,
it's a small right? Staff. So they are good people. They don't know what's happened either, and they are now, the end. The one that's communicating with me about next steps. So all to say, nobody is trained well, nobody is well supported. The buck is kind of passed, down. And so these people that I'm speaking with are great, but, they file a report, they gave me a ticket. In that moment, there's, nothing you can do. My car was parked at the airport, but I couldn't have gotten to my car or into my car had I, been able to. And so, my mom came and picked me up. Like, just imagine that every aspect of your moment moving forward, small and large, is disrupted. I went and stayed at my mom's house in South Bend actually that night, and they let me take home this airport wheelchair as a loaner, and it actually didn't fit through the doorways of the bathroom or my bedroom in the house. So it's just not enough.
And it's one thing after the other. It's like, not only is this not like this, it's just not working. And your point about dignity, when you strip someone of their dignity, that's an emotional load, and it's really hard.
It is, and it immediately triggers in me a lot of guilt, because in that moment, I was going to be okay, right? Like I knew that I could call my mom to help pick me up. I knew that I had a old chair that is old, but it works, collecting dust in my basement that I pulled up and that I was able to use. I knew that, my work was remote, that I'd be able to do that. I knew that I was going to be okay, but that is not the case for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of disabled people, a month, let alone a year, that are encountering this senseless damage, and then that either develop physical sores or that are injured because they don't have their medical equipment, are not able to eat because, their GI tube that's attached to their chair was damaged in some way, are not able to communicate because their communication device that is attached to their chair was damaged, whatever it may be. And that, of course, doesn't make me any less disabled, but in the moment, there's a lot of really guilt and shame about the privilege that I hold as somebody that will be okay, but that is still really, whose dignity has really been stripped away. So, and to kind of wrap off, I know I said I'd keep the answer short, but a little status update. That occurred in February, and my chair is not yet fixed. And again, I've been able to, navigate the day-to-day because I have this backup that I'm able to use. But the last estimate I had of when a new chair would be provided to me was September. So
oh my God.
nothing happens quickly. It's all very sterile and bureaucratic, and a lot of the onus, administrative onus is put on the person whose equipment has been damaged to, schedule appointments or to communicate, be the middleman. And it's really unconscionable. And again, for something that is preventable by absolutely no reason that 28, 29 wheelchairs every single day in this country alone, not even in the world, just in the US, are being damaged, if not destroyed.
And it's the only, for those who may not have watched any of our previous episodes, and I'll ask Bill to put them up in the chat, we had conversations with folks on two other occasions, one specifically about disabled veterans, another one about the Department of Transportation's Disability Bill of Rights, and when that was launching. And it came up time in both of those conversations, and I'm going to reinforce it again. Airline travel is the only form of travel that wheelchair users have to give up their wheelchair.
Yep.
If you are taking a car service, you keep it with you, or you're even in it. When I have neighbors of mine who are in wheelchairs, they get picked up by a service, they roll onto the vehicle. When someone is going onto mass transit, you keep your wheelchair, you're in your wheelchair. When I take a ferry boat to Cape Cod, people are in their wheelchair. Mm-hmm. It is the only form of transit. And so when you're on a Amtrak, you stay in your chair. So this is a major issue. And from an advocacy standpoint, the more and more you can be there to be a vocal advocate in this, I think is that much more important. And especially if you are somebody who has, say, frequent flyer miles and you are in the Diamond Club or whatever it is with your airline, you have status. Make a call, find out how fast they're doing, and tell them that you are paying attention to what this airline is or is not doing. I want to move to something that is more on the ground, and that is how you get around South Bend. And how you get around when you were living in DC, working at the White House and that sort of thing. When I was in college, 1,000 years ago. I was enrolled in a class, and the professor was Professor Howard Zinn. Now, a lot of people know Howard Zinn. He wrote all kinds of. He was a hippie, but he was a big social justice guy. And he gave us an assignment where we had to become an advocate, or we had to become like kind of heighten our ability to kind of understand about how do we advocate for and how do we speak up for things. And I was put in a group project, and one of my friends who was in the project with me was a wheelchair user, and he was. And now this was back in 1987, I think I took the class, and he was in a motorized wheelchair, and it was a lot bigger than what you see nowadays because of technology advances and all that. Things get smaller, but we were trying to decide what our project was, and he said, I want to know how many curb cuts are at my university, because let me tell you about how I get to class. And he talked to us through this whole idea of how he made it to class every day, and where he lived, what residence hall he was in, and how he had to actually go way out of his way to get to the classroom buildings because there weren't enough curb cuts. And so we decided we're going to do this. We counted how many curb cuts at Boston University in 1987, and we counted how many automatic door openers there were. And we wrote up this, and we made a big thing about it. And to help people understand what it was like, we used some of those same wheelchairs that you just explained, where, you know, you had them at the health center and they gave them out if you maybe twisted an ankle or something like that. And we said, try to get from this end of campus to that end of campus and see how long it takes you. I know that South Bend was known for, when Pete was the mayor, there was this Smart Streets program. And with Smart Streets, there may have been curb cuts and things like that. Talk to us about how curb cuts, how accessibility of sidewalks, maintenance of sidewalks, clearing of snow, all those kind of things. How does that impact your life, on that quality of life, just getting around town and doing Emily day-to-day Emily stuff?
Yeah. So this might surprise some people, but kind of counterintuitively, getting around South Bend is a lot more reliably accessible to me than getting around DC was. And it's a little bit apples and oranges, right? And it's by no means like a small town and a big city comparison. But South Bend, I'm largely driving. So I drive myself. I use hand controls and have a van with a ramp that pops out that I can roll my chair into and then hop over to the driver's seat. So driving is, huge. You have to worry about snow removal and other things, but that's kind of par for the course. And then the infrastructure of our city is really pretty well maintained, particularly in walkable areas of South Bend. So downtown or walking around my neighborhood. That's of course a generalization, but really fortunate that in a place, a small community, if there's something that is going to be inaccessible or going to be inconvenient or unsafe to disabled people or otherwise, people are going to speak up, and they're going to be in the mayor's ear and they're going to get it fixed. So it's a much smaller sandbox that we're working in, and so really fortunate that we've got some great infrastructure here in South Bend. DC, on the other hand, a lot of parts about it were surprisingly really navigable for me. So for example, the metro, which I used quite a bit while I was in DC, is the most accessible kind of like subway or metro that I've ever used. My sister lives in New York City, and I love to visit her, but the subway cannot even be part of the equation because not all the stops are accessible. The elevators are frequently out. There's often a step to get into the subway itself from the platform. But in DC, all of the cars are level or flush with the platform. All the stations have elevators, and the elevators are regularly kind of the like maintenance status is regularly updated online. So it's not a perfect system by any means, but it was surprisingly a lot more navigable. The sidewalks, on the other hand, not always great. The curb cuts, not always great. They're just not as well kept, right? They've got more traffic. It's a larger place. The funding structures are different. And not that that is an excuse. Like I said, it's a little bit apples and oranges, but there were definitely, pros and cons of each place. I really like, though, your in working through this exercise, you mentioned how many elevators your classmate passed through, how many, doors with automatic door buttons. When I was living in DC, just to get to work one way, I had to utilize 6 different elevators. And if any single one of those was out of service, there was not a backup. So they were all single, what am I trying to say? Like single stall elevators.
Yeah, there was one bay. So there was one elevator bay.
Bay, that's the word.
If the bay goes, you're done.
Exactly. So, and that is really challenging, as you can imagine, because that is not something that you can work around, that you can kind of adapt around or find a fix to. If that elevator is out, you've got to find a different way. So it is something I'm, super cognizant about. It admittedly, there are parts of DC that I miss, but it has admittedly given me a lot more peace of mind to be able to confidently predict the environments that I'm going to be in here in South Bend. I don't need to, use 6 elevators to go anywhere, let alone as part of my daily commute. So, so it's different and certainly certainly different in different parts of the country, but that's at least been my experience in comparing the two.
There's the part of the reason I wanted to bookend those questions is that airlines are one end, but then the day-to-day, I mean, you get on a plane for a reason.
Right.
When you go outside, it could be just living life, and there's not necessarily, some biblical reason that you're going across town, right? You might be out of milk, you just got to go get it, right? And this is why I think that there's so much of this. And one of the things that Jonathan, one of our fellow board members, put up is about ADA guidelines and things of that nature. And we know that cities and states need to abide by that. But it really, a lot of it comes down to when it's time to replace something. Or if there's a moment where someone says, we don't have it in this neighborhood, and now there's a family that's moved in and we need it, and that sort of thing. And I think that, but over my lifetime, one of the things that I've noticed is that as universal design becomes more in play within these public spaces, it's for the enjoyment of everybody, and that's really the point of universal design. Universal design allows for that. A question did come up from one of the folks in the chat, and this was about folks who might be, and this is something in your experience, maybe in the White House or in your experience even in conversations on the road with Chasten or anything like that, or in your own space, is that when there's folks who might be elderly folk, okay, and when you are looking at someone who has move their way into a portion of their life, or maybe they're not as able to get around on their own. Maybe they need a walker or a wheelchair or something of that nature, but they were not born having to be in a wheelchair user. Is there a difference in that kind of advocacy in your mind? As someone who's been an advocate, should we be framing this differently? How do we kind of consider this? And my follow-up question to that too is we've all had family members or friends who were not wheelchair users one day and the next day they were, whether because they had a stroke or they fell or some other kind of thing happened, and now their whole life gets upended. So I guess my second question, my follow-up question to that is that when you are now in a new space with someone in your life who needs an advocate, do you have a recommendation on where they can get their kind of advocacy 101 papers and know where to go so they can help this person who they care about? So is there a difference, and where can people go to get educated?
Yeah. So in my opinion, there is not a difference. I am of the belief that there is power in numbers, that disability is othering because people think they don't know somebody that looks like me, right? But a little bit like what we talked about at the top, disability is the only identity that people can come into at any point in their life, either temporarily or permanently. And that can, that does include, people that age into their disability. And maybe they don't wear a capital D on their sleeve and engage, in like formal, organizing or advocacy. But they have a disability, and their access is part of this larger conversation around what can we be doing to make spaces, physical and virtual, more accessible to people with disabilities. So the long way of saying no, I don't think there is a difference. In fact, I think there is great power in looking at our own orbits and thinking, disability isn't just me, the person who uses a wheelchair. It's also my aunt with a cancer diagnosis. It's also my cousin who has a learning disability. It's also, my neighbor who broke their leg and, has to have surgery and is going to be a wheelchair user for a few weeks, right? There's great power in that, because then suddenly you're not thinking of, these one-off exceptions to the rule. It's what can we be doing to build a world that is inclusive of all of us, that is accessible to all of us, that we don't need to be, tacking on solutions to as an afterthought or when they're necessary, but is built on the front end to be welcoming and to be inclusive. As for where can you get support in advocacy, the American Association of People with Disabilities is a phenomenal resource. I really feel that the cornerstone of advocacy and allyship is using language to talk about disability and using it confidently and knowing, that language is affirming and empowering. So Laura, a bit, and I almost paused you to like grab onto a little thread that I saw, but you mentioned how beautiful it was, reiterated, my statement that it was so beautiful that my students, didn't have these filters and that they would just ask questions. And the beauty is, right, they don't hesitate to use the language of disability. And maybe it's not always correct, right? And that was okay. That's what our classroom was about. That's what our community was about, was, this culture of error where we make mistakes and we talk about maybe what better words to use are. But it was beautiful that they weren't reticent to try to engage, right?
Right.
I think often in instances of difference, whether it be around race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, whatever it may be, if we don't have the language to talk about that difference, one of two things happens. Either one, we use language that is harmful, and maybe we didn't intend for it to be harmful, but it had a harmful impact. Yep. Or more frequently or more commonly, in my experience, we just don't engage at all. So we say, right, I don't know how to talk about race, or I don't know how to talk about the LGBTQ community, or I don't know how to talk about poverty, whatever it may be. So I'm just not going to do it because I don't want to cause harm. And that in and of itself is harmful because it keeps, in this case, disability out of the conversation.
Right.
So AAPD, American Association of People with Disabilities, AAPD, has a ton of phenomenal resources about just the 101s of like, this is what you need to know in order to confidently talk about disability in a way that is, not medical or jargony, but it's just affirming and is empowering.
Right.
So that is what I'd say. The rest will come with time, right? You don't, as we discussed earlier, there's not like a moment when you put on this advocacy hat and then, it's not all that different from just what organizing and advocacy looks like in your day-to-day life. You're just using the language of disability, which is in and of itself, moves mountains. So.
And I think that thank you for bringing up AAPD. That we've just put that information in the chat, and we will make sure that it's on the description for today's YouTube video. But I think there's also one of the things I want to key in on that you just said is, I don't want you to act like a child, but I want you to think like a child. And is that there's a difference, okay? And that idea of, I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to talk to me like I'm 8 years old. I don't understand this, or I don't know how to talk about this. Tell me what is the best way to say this or ask this question. And that sort of thing is really important, because then the other piece of it, at least this is what I've found, and Emily, let me know what your thoughts are, is that when asking this question in a space of care and authenticity, the person hearing it is like, okay, they want to be educated. So they give me all the information that I need in order to do better by them. And the other piece of it is also, advocacy is not stripping away someone else's being. Okay. And that, I think sometimes people want to be an ally or an advocate, and then they start talking for somebody. That's not allyship. That's not advocacy. I have a friend who oftentimes says, I don't want you to be my ally. I want you to be my accomplice. And I kind of, it's a nice kind of thought about this. It's like, you have to keep this person, the person you're their accomplice, you have to make sure the accomplice keeps their microphone. You never take the microphone. And it's super important that we keep that in mind. When I want to move this to some of the things, like in your work in the White House, for instance, and you've got to talk to people. I'm sure there were people who were on the entire spectrum of understanding what was going on. And people who didn't feel like government was acting fast enough, and then other people who thought things were going too fast. And you yourself have your own perspective, and but when you are speaking to someone who so emphatically wants to see something change, and because you were in the room where it happened, or you were in a meeting, and this is not going to happen tomorrow. This is going to be something that's going to be, doable bits, but it's going to get done. How do you have those conversations with somebody who you can see the agony in their eye, or you can see the passion coming from their core, that they want something to happen quickly and it's not? And where do you kind of go from that idea of, I'm going to advocate, I'm going to be this person who can kind of tell the truth, but also then when the camera goes off from the meeting, what is your first action? What do you do, and how do you kind of say, I just looked someone in the eye and I need you to know what happened in this meeting, and these are the things that are having true impact on their ability to get around and be a dignified contributor in our country?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and it's something that I certainly grappled with, and I grapple with as somebody that was personally and professionally in this role, that was not able to log off at the end of the day, as if that actually happened. We were on all the time, but was not able to just clock out for the day, so to speak, and be done with my work. I was the disabled constituent that I was engaging with, right? For elected officials, I think it's really important to build trust, to build rapport. And so that when, legislation, bureaucracy takes time, which it inevitably does, you can look that elected official or that representative of the elected official in the eye and know with confidence that they see you, that they hear you, that they believe you, and that they are working their darndest to get on behalf of you. personally speaking, that at times was, as I said, very difficult for me in my role at the White House, because it is politics and there was a lot at play, and I knew where I stood. I was so grateful that President Biden and the Biden-Harris administration were advocating on behalf of our community in so many ways, certainly in a lot more ways than the former administration. But they weren't able to do it all. And they can't, politics is politics. You can't do it all. You certainly can't do it in the first year and a half of your administration. But it was really hard for me to reconcile the urgency that I was dealing with in my community and the slow gears of change happening in the executive branch. So what I did, how I reconciled that, was I was constantly collecting stories from the people that I would speak to, whether they were, chairs of the boards of, disabled associations, whether they were, Joe Schmo in XYZ in America, because I made it a point to talk to everybody. You could call, back when I was at the White House, you could call the White House switchboard and be connected through to my cell phone, which is wild to think, but talk to everybody and collect stories and take those back. I was not speaking directly to the president. Maybe that is, I was always quick to say that. There are, reporting structures in place. I wasn't just following up with the president directly, but those reporting structures were in place. And I would take those stories and I would say, Bob Smith in Austin, Texas needs our help. And I would pass along these stories. And I did that as frequently as I could, because I know, and I knew this on the campaign trail too, right? That policy wonks are a dime a dozen, statistics are a dime a dozen, and they're so important in their own respect. But it is stories, it is that lived experience, that real raw urgency that moves the needle. And so anything I could do to share those stories that I was hearing with the powers that be, I would do that whenever I could. So, and I would report back and say, I've passed along your story. I know we're close to time, but I'll close with one specific kind of vignette. In the first month of my time at the White House, I was approached by Vice President Harris's team, who wanted to put together an event in advance of Disability Pride Month of July, that was actually around access to the vote for people with disabilities. And we had a roundtable where advocates came in. It was closed press, so they were able to speak with her candidly about what the administration was doing and needed to be doing on behalf of disabled Americans, protecting their franchise. And I heard the vice president reiterating those stories for months and months and months and months through the end of my time in the administration, and how poignant they were in the ways in which she was telling those stories, carrying that torch for these people. And that's advocacy, right? To your point of like, she wasn't commandeering the mic, but she was able to say, I heard from Galen Tootle in this meeting. I heard from, of course, all their names are escaping me. All these incredible advocates, you can't pull them up when you need them. But I heard from these folks in this meeting, and this is what their experiences in Birmingham, Alabama, or in Sacramento, California. And this is what we need to be doing to change this reality for them. So there's incredible power in story. Never forget that. Again, you don't have to be in the highest office. You don't have to be an advocate, whatever that may mean, in order to share your story, and in order to, incite urgency with that story.
I'm glad you ended with that, because I think that one of the questions that a lot of people are wondering is, how do you better advocate? And how do you become somebody who actually pays more attention, I think, to the idea of disability access and inclusion. And if there is something from a transportation end, to try to put a little transportation bow on this, is there something coming down the pike that you're actually like happy, or either it's coming down the pike or you're driving on the pike on it right now, that you said, this was actually a game changer. This is actually something that has made lives better from the transit realm. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say for anyone who is interested in more of the kind of like policy advocacy, reaching out to your electeds, there are two really critical pieces of legislation that have recently been introduced. One, the bipartisan FAA Reauthorization Act, and then another, the Mobile Act, which was introduced by Senator Duckworth. Both, and I'll leave you to look them up, and maybe we can drop the links to them.
Absolutely, put them in
the info box afterwards. But both include incredible provisions that protect the rights of all travelers, but with particular, eye for travelers with disabilities. You do not need to be, a lobbyist, a donor, even a voter, to reach out to your elected officials, your congressmen, your senators, your governor, and show support for this legislation or legislation like it. And I really encourage you to do so. As somebody that has been on the receiving end, again, of that feedback, people are listening. There is power in volume and in numbers, and being able to have people, reach out and say, I'm in support of this, bill that was recently introduced. Both are in the very beginning stages, but there is power in that and in your voice as, as allies. So would really encourage you to dig in. What you can do in the moment is, I would say, if you are getting on or off a plane, you're traveling and you see somebody, with a disability, instead of assuming that they need help or saying, what can I do to help? As is often, maybe our first instinct, we want to be helpful. Instead, just be a watchful ally. If something doesn't feel right as you see them, being helped to get on the plane, or as you see them deplaning and maybe their chairs and theirs, offer to be a support. If they say, that they don't need support, then of course, respect that. But just keep a watchful eye. As I was navigating this experience, again, with my damaged chair here most recently, there were so many people that just walked right by. And again, I think that is a product of our discomfort with disability and with knowing how to interact with and around disability. But there was parts of me that wished that even just somebody would stop and say, maybe they couldn't help, but like show a little allyship, right? And say, hey, I see you, you're not going through this alone.
Right.
And so that's what I'd say. Just, being aware of your environment.
I really appreciate that as a final thought. And I think that, Emily, you brought up a lot of really great points tonight, and I know that we'll be processing them. I like to marinate. I'll be marinating for quite some time on this conversation. And Emily Voorde, you're always welcome back to Build the Era and to any of our events. And we hope to see, we're excited about what's coming up in your life moving forward. You were always part of Team Pete, so we will see you out there on the trail, as they like to say.
I love it.
And I want to just remind folks that if you are not on our newsletter, please go to buildtheera.com and sign up for our newsletter. And our second printing of Rhonda Loves Roundabouts is out there right now. it makes a great back to school gift. So get on out there and order that. You can find that on the website as well. So thank you all so much. And Emily, have a great remainder of your summer. I hope you get some beach time. Okay.
Thank you all. And please stay in touch. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Threads. I'm on Instagram. Please stay in touch. Really, it feels like family. It was really good to be with you all here. Continue the conversation and let me know how I can be of help.
Thank you so much. Oh, and Daisy says thank you too. Okay. Everyone have a great night, everybody.